The day I was sworn in as a federal prosecutor, my half-brother showed up to destroy me. And instead, the United States attorney stood in front of 200 people and said, "This woman put her career on the line to do the right thing, and someone in this room tried to stop her." I should have felt nothing but pride that morning. I'd worked 7 years for that moment. 7 years of 80-hour weeks, of ramen at midnight, of calling my mom from courthouse parking garages just to hear a familiar voice. But standing in the atrium of the federal building in downtown Chicago, in my best blazer and the pearl earrings my grandmother left me, all I could think was, he's here. Somewhere in that crowd, he's here. Let me back up. My name is not important. What's important is this. I grew up as the daughter of a woman who believed that keeping a family together was more sacred than keeping her children safe. My mother remarried when I was 9. My stepfather was fine, quiet, mostly absent, the kind of man who watched sports and didn't make trouble. His son was another story. Nolan was 17 when he came to live with us. I was 12. From the first week, he made it clear that I was an inconvenience in what he considered his father's house. He'd eat the dinner I'd made before I could sit down. He'd tell his friends I was stupid in front of me, laughing when I flinched. He borrowed money from my mother and she never asked for it back. Small things, people would say. Kids being kids. But small things accumulate. When I got into Northwestern on a merit scholarship, Nolan told my mother I'd probably cheated. She didn't defend me. She said, "Let's not make this a whole thing." I packed a bag that weekend and spent most of college not coming home. Law school came next, then a clerkship, then an entry-level position at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Chicago. I was 28 years old, and I was exactly where I wanted to be. I had a small apartment in Logan Square with a leaky radiator and a view of the alley, and I loved it more than anywhere I'd ever lived because nobody in it had ever made me feel small. I didn't think about Nolan much during those years. He floated in and out of my mother's updates, a job lost here, a move there, a girlfriend who left, a landlord dispute. I nodded on the phone and changed the subject. Then I got assigned to a public corruption case. I can't give you details, even now. What I can say is that the case involved a mid-level city contracts official who had been steering public infrastructure money toward a shell company. Routine, by federal corruption standards. Except the shell company traced back to a holding group, and the holding group had a silent investor, and that investor's name appeared in documents our office subpoenaed from a private equity firm. It was Nolan. I sat at my desk at 11:30 on a Tuesday night staring at his name on a financial disclosure form and felt the floor tilt. I called my supervisor the next morning and disclosed the conflict immediately. That's the rule. That's what you do. She thanked me and told me she'd reassign the file. Nolan found out within the week. I still don't know exactly how. Someone talked, or he had a contact, or he just put the timing together. But I got a call from my mother asking me to be reasonable, and I knew. "He says you're trying to ruin him," she told me. "Mom, I removed myself from the case. I have nothing to do with the investigation." "He says you reported him." I disclosed a conflict of interest. That's required by law. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You know how hard things have been for him." I hung up. The investigation proceeded without me. I focused on my own caseload. Months passed. I made the decision not to think about what was happening down the hall in the file room with the case I was no longer allowed to touch. What I didn't know was that Nolan had been telling anyone who would listen that I had targeted him, that I had some personal vendetta, that I'd used my position to go after my own family member out of old resentment. He told the story to my mother, to his lawyer, and I would later find out to a contact at a local news blog that covered local politics with all the rigor of a high school newspaper. There was a small piece, source close to the investigation questions prosecutorial neutrality. My name wasn't in it, but enough was implied that 2 colleagues asked me about it, carefully, the way people do when they want to know something without being seen as the person who asked. I went to my supervisor. She told me to keep my head down. She said the office stood behind me. She said it would pass. It did not immediately pass. Nolan's attorney filed a motion alleging selective prosecution. It was a long shot. Those motions almost always are. but it meant my name was now in a court filing, spelled out attached to language about bias and improper motive. I sat in my apartment that night with a glass of wine I didn't drink and thought about quitting. Not because I'd done anything wrong, because being right and being protected are not the same thing, and I was exhausted of learning that lesson. My mother called twice that week. I let it go to voicemail. I want to be honest about something. I was scared. Not in a dramatic way. In the grinding, low-level way that wears you down when you know someone is working to discredit you, and you can't fully defend yourself, because the process has to run its course. I lost 7 pounds. I stopped sleeping past 4 in the morning. I started taking the long way to the office so I didn't have to walk past the courtroom where the hearings were scheduled. The motion was denied. The judge's written order was 3 pages and methodical, and it concluded that there was no evidence of selective prosecution and no basis to question the integrity of the case. My name appeared in that order too. This time cleared. I read it in my car in the parking garage. I sat there for 20 minutes. Then I drove home and slept for 11 hours straight. The case resolved 6 months later with a guilty plea. Nolan's name was in the press release as one of the associated parties receiving a deferred prosecution agreement with significant financial penalties and mandatory cooperation. I had nothing to do with the final resolution. I was never consulted, but I read every word of the press release, alone in my office with the door closed, and I felt something I couldn't quite name. Not satisfaction, exactly. More like, it happened. The truth existed in a public record now. It couldn't be undone. The swearing-in ceremony for new assistant U.S. attorneys was scheduled 3 weeks later. I'd been promoted after my annual review, a bump in title that meant a larger caseload and slightly more responsibility, nothing glamorous. The ceremony was in the atrium of the federal building, the one with the high glass ceiling and the flags on either side of the dais. Partners, family, and colleagues were invited. I invited my 2 closest friends from law school and my grandmother's sister, Aunt Cecile, who was 81 and had driven up from Joliet because she said she'd be there even if it killed her. I did not invite my mother. I did not tell Nolan it was happening. He found out anyway. I know this now because of what happened. At the time, I was standing near the windows with Aunt Cecile and a cup of coffee, watching people filter in, when I saw my mother come through the main entrance. She was wearing a yellow cardigan I recognized. She looked nervous. Behind her was Nolan. He was in a jacket and tie. He'd cut his hair. He looked from across the atrium like someone attending a routine professional function, which I suppose was the point. I set down my coffee cup. Aunt Cecile followed my gaze and put her hand on my arm. "Do you want to leave?" she asked. "No," I said. "I'm not leaving." I found my supervisor, who by this point was more of an ally than a manager, and told her quietly that my half-brother, who had been a party to a case our office had recently resolved, was in the room. She absorbed this without visible reaction. She nodded once, said thank you for telling me, and walked toward the building security officers stationed near the entrance. I didn't see what was said. I went to find my seat. The ceremony was exactly as formal and procedural as federal ceremonies always are. There were remarks from the first assistant and a video addressed from Washington. There was a reading of the Professional Responsibility Code. We raised our right hands and repeated the oath to support and defend the Constitution, to bear true faith and allegiance, to faithfully discharge the duties of the office. I said every word like I meant it, because I did. When the United States Attorney took the podium for closing remarks, I was barely listening. I was watching Nolan, who had positioned himself near the back of the room beside my mother, and I was doing the math on how to get Aunt Cecile out without walking past them. The U.S. Attorney, a woman who had spent 30 years in federal service and who I had spoken to exactly twice, went slightly off script. "Before I close," she said, "I want to acknowledge something that doesn't always get acknowledged. This office, like all institutions, depends on people doing the right thing even when it costs them. I want to recognize an attorney in this room who, earlier this year, identified a conflict of interest in an active investigation and reported it immediately, voluntarily, without being asked. She did that knowing it would create complications for her, knowing it might raise questions she'd have to answer publicly. She did it because it was correct. That's not a small thing. That is exactly the kind of integrity this office is built on. She looked toward my section. "Congratulations," she said. "And thank you." The room applauded. I felt my face go very still the way it does when I'm trying not to cry in a professional setting. Afterward, during the reception, I learned from my supervisor that Nolan had approached her during the ceremony, shortly after the U.S. Attorney's remarks, and she described it carefully, made some comments that had led to him being escorted from the building by the security officer. My mother left with him. I never got the full account of what he said. I didn't need it. Aunt Cecile got a plate of the reception food and a glass of sparkling water, and we stood near the windows, and she told me about the time my grandmother had stood in a similar atrium in a different city for a different ceremony and worn, she was nearly certain, similar earrings. She would have said something embarrassing, Aunt Cecile told me. She always did at things like this. She would have wept openly and told everyone around her who you were. I laughed, which surprised me. That would have been mortifying. It would have been, she agreed, but she would have meant every bit of it. I thought about mortifying love. About the kind that shows up without being invited, not to cause damage, but to witness. I thought about my mother in the yellow cardigan and everything that had gone wrong between us, and everything that I had stopped hoping for. That night I called my mother. She answered on the second ring, which surprised me. There was a long pause after I said her name. "I heard what the woman said about you," my mother offered, finally. "At the ceremony." "Yeah." Another pause. "Was it about Nolan's case?" "It was about me," I said. "About what I did." She was quiet for a while. I could hear the television in the background, the murmur of whatever she watched in the evenings. Then she said, "I'm sorry I brought him. It wasn't everything. It wasn't close to everything." But it was the first time in my adult life she had said those words to me about him, and I filed it away in the same place I file all the small true things that don't resolve anything but still matter. "I know," I said. We talked for 12 more minutes about nothing important, her neighbor's fence, a sale at the grocery store, the weather, which had turned cold early. When I hung up, I sat in my apartment in Logan Square and looked at the framed copy of the oath I printed out and hung above my desk 6 months before I ever took it, the way some people hang a goal on the wall to remind themselves what they're working toward. I thought about all the versions of myself that had existed before that morning. The 12-year-old who set the table for a boy who didn't thank her, the college student who didn't come home for holidays because home didn't feel safe, the law student who worked double shifts at a restaurant to cover what her scholarship didn't, who slept 5 hours a night and told herself it was temporary, the young attorney who sat in a parking garage and cried over a court order that cleared her name. All of those women had made choices that led to this room, this apartment, this framed oath on the wall, this evening after a day that was everything I had worked for. I wasn't grateful to Nolan. I don't believe that suffering is a gift, or that cruelty builds character. I believe cruelty is cruelty, and it leaves marks, and the marks don't disappear because the story ends well. But I was still here. I had done the work. I'd told the truth every single time it was asked of me, and several times when it wasn't, and I had not let anyone's version of who I was replace my own. That, I have learned, is the only revenge that actually holds.